Can anyone tell me what we talked about last week? From Genesis chapter 9.
The aftermath of the flood.
The aftermath of the flood, Ruth? Rainbows, yeah. What was the rainbow? What was the rainbow? Anybody remember? Silas? God's promise, right? There was a promise that God made, a covenant he made. And the rainbow wasn't the promise, right? He didn't promise to send rainbows, right? The rainbow was something else. There was a covenant God made, and the rainbow was what? It was connected to that covenant. What was it? Remember? I'm wearing one on my finger for a different covenant. This is a covenant between Angela and I, and this is what? What is this? It's not a trick question. What is this? It's a ring. And this is a sign of that covenant. Just like the rainbow is a sign of God's covenant. Who is the rainbow meant? Now we see the rainbow, but who is the rainbow most meant for? No, not for Noah, not mostly to Noah. Anybody remember? Let's just read, and this is just review. This isn't part of the message, Jared. You can record it if you like, I suppose. But how about Genesis chapter 9 and verse 14? Let's start in verse 13. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. So the rainbow is actually a reminder to God. It's God's reminder to God, not to destroy the whole earth again because of the mess we make. And he has determined that, and he's promised that one day a seed would come from the woman and overturn all that's gone wrong and make a way for us to come back to God. But in the meantime, before that had happened, God promised that he was not going to, between then and between when Christ would come, and actually until Christ comes again, he's never going to just, as offensive as our sins may be, as big of a mess as it may be, he's never going to just destroy us all except for a couple and just kind of start afresh again. He's never going to do that. He's promised he won't. And what he's done is he's taken, some people talk about signs, and signs are sometimes more helpful the more fitting they are. Like if you have a sign and you're trying to advertise, you put a sign on the side of the road for maybe a hamburger restaurant. If you put a big juicy hamburger on there, that's pretty appealing. If you just write cheap hamburgers on the sign or something, that's not going to do it. But if you say you have this beautiful, oh, it looks so good, hamburger on there, and it says $1.99, everybody's that likes hamburgers is going to pull off the road and go get you a hamburger. And so this is the way it is. Signs are more effective a lot of times when they resemble or there's something fitting about them. And a lot of times if you go to a wedding, people will talk about this ring of gold being significant and that it doesn't have an end, right? It just goes around. It doesn't start here and end there. It's eternal. You never get to the end of the ring. Or that it's golden and it's of precious metal and it's of value. And so they've given you a sign that costs them something and that means something to them and should be long-lasting and precious to who you give it to. Well, this sign of this covenant that God makes is actually a sign of a bow in the clouds. And just like in our English, that bow, we have several different terms for bow. We have, one of the girls have mentioned a hair bow, and that's not exactly the kind of bow that God put in the sky. But there's a weapon. There's the bow and arrow. And the bow is what you use when you go to war. and you mean to do harm to someone. And this is what God says he's done, is he has taken his bow, his weapon of war, and he's hung it up in the clouds in the sky as a reminder that he has decided, he's made a decision to take that bow and to hang it up. And he's not going to deal with the sinfulness of men in that way again until all is accomplished, until the final day. And so it's a wonderful promise. But the rainbow is actually a reminder to God about his promise to not execute us all, though man deserves it. And so it's a wonderful promise. It provides us with tomorrow, or it provides us with today. It provides us with the time necessary to repent. And this is what God gives us in this covenant with Noah. Now that's just a lot more that was said last week about this Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 17, but I just wanted to do that very quickly by way of review and to remind you. One of the things also that was said, I'll say one more thing, is that we have not just a covenant that God makes, but I kind of described it as kind of a new direction that God moves in now. He had already promised again what he was going to do, and that there was one that was going to come from the woman. And it's not as though God just totally changed his course, but God, up until now, God had been willing at any moment, you might think, to destroy mankind from off the face of the earth and just start afresh. And now he's no longer willing to do that. He's taken one of his options off the table. He's playing short-handed, you might say, with one hand tied behind his back. If he's going to bring this thing to fruition now, he can't just wipe everything clean and start over anymore. He has to just continually work with the sinful group he's got, and that doesn't change. And so he's left with what he has. If he's going to bring his purposes to fruition, he's going to have to do it with the sinful lot that's on the earth. And so the Lord sets out in something of a new direction, it seems. It's in a manner of speaking. Humanity now has this new covenant that God has made to them, and it can be relied upon. Now, what I'd like to do is to pray and then read the rest of Genesis chapter 9, verses 18 through 29, and then we'll begin. Let's do that. Father in heaven, certainly we are cast on you to make this text do anything for us. I confess, I know myself, it's a text often breezed through, and on my way to, as I rush on to get to the stories of Abraham. And so I ask that the things that I trust you've shown me out of this passage, I would be able to show to others in a way that would help them and help us all to gain and to profit from what Moses wrote, as we should. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Let's read these verses, shall we? The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark. Picture that in your mind. However you picture it. The sons of Noah, did they have a ramp? Did they climb down? And did they carve out a new door out of the side for the animals? What did they do? I don't know, but it was a very real thing. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark, they'd been on there for a year. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Now that's the preamble. We're getting ready to give you a story about what happened, and what before the story begins, you need to know these things. Remember, these are the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Now here's the story. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine, and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. All right, now just by way of introduction, I think more than any other passage we've come to so far in Genesis, this text reminds me that Genesis is a very curious book, in that while it covers great and sweeping events like the creation of the world, like man's fall into sin, like the great flood, the saving of a vast number of people from a widespread famine. This is big stuff. It also contains seemingly insignificant events in obscure people's lives. Or in the case of Noah and his descendants, not so obscure people, but certainly insignificant events, it seems. For instance, Abraham bartering for rights to a small plot of land. The night dreams of several different men. I mean, why do I care about what those men dreamed about? Or even the sort of thing we read about today of one son probably making a mockery of his father to his brothers, and then the outcome that follows that. I mean, really? In the course of a couple thousand years, we're going to cover this event? How could this possibly have any significance to you or I today? How could it be significant to any of the Israelites or to Moses? How could it possibly matter? The section that we are in within the book of Genesis right now is titled The Generations of Noah, or we might say the outworkings of Noah's life. And let me just list for you right now just some of the things that we know about Noah. First of all, he was born carrying the hopes of his father for a relief for humanity from their hard work and their toil. So he was born with the hopes that he would somehow set men free and deliver men from this toil and their hard work. We also know Noah was a righteous man who walked with God in the midst of a very perverse and a very crooked people. We know he had 3 sons, and we know their names. We know that he found favor with God and was spared in the flood of waters, that he obediently built an ark and preserved the life of his family and some of all the animals that God sent him. He made an altar to God when he got off the ark in order to acknowledge God for who he was and to give expression to his sense of probably sinfulness and his own sense of thankfulness to be spared, and an expression of his submission to God and his loyalty to God as he sets out on the world. Outside of those details, which are significant, but outside of those details, we know nothing about Noah except his age, when the flood of waters came, and when he stepped off the ark, we know his age. And we'll learn in verses 28 and 29 how old he was when he died. That's all we know about Noah except for this event that we just read about. In his whole life. Now, as much as this man may have had many fascinating details and anecdotes worthy of hearing from his 950-year life, none are told except the flood and except this story here. I don't know of any old man, and I don't think you do either, who doesn't have quite a few good old stories to tell. I mean, I don't care what his life was like. There's something in there that he wants to tell you and that you'll get a laugh out of, or that you'll be impressed with, or you'll learn something from. It's worthwhile to sit and listen to old men and old women tell their stories. And Noah lived at least 10 times as long as any of those people you've talked to. 950 years old. So he lived 10 long lifetimes. Moses doesn't give us any of that accrued wisdom. No other stories from Noah's life. Just this one time where he got drunk and passed out and his son saw him and what happened there, and then he woke up and he cursed him. That's the story we get. And you think, I mean, isn't there anything better to choose from? Why give me this story? I mean, up till now, I've been thinking really high of Noah, and you've really knocked him down a notch. And this whole thing, it's just kind of strange. Why tell me this story? Of all the things to tell us, we read about this incident concerning Noah and his son Ham. But then even at that, the story is told with just a bewildering brevity. I mean, what do you mean he saw him? What do you mean he told his brothers? What did he tell them? This is incredible. Do you realize that the very first thing in the entire Bible that Noah speaks is this curse upon Canaan? Noah never spoke this whole time. The only words we have of Noah is this. It's unbelievable. Two things. He curses Canaan and then he blesses God. And that's what he does. It's amazing. This is the words of Noah, this righteous man. So there's just so much it's just told so brief. I mean, if the aim of Moses was to tell us something from Noah's life to remember him by, or to help tell us some of the more entertaining parts of his life, he's certainly done a lousy job. So don't use the story that way, right? I mean, if it's obviously not told in that way to benefit me in those ways, then just right now put it in your mind, I'm not going to let this story just serve that function, just as an interesting kind of thing that happened, and I don't know why it's there. I guess somebody cared about it. I don't know why Moses had these weird interests, but I don't share them. That's not it. It wasn't Moses' interest either. We've seen certainly Moses is very gifted as a writer, very able to make his point. He's developed as a writer, and he's not done a poor job in telling us the story. So we have to ask just exactly what was the point of the story. And I have 5 answers to that question. There are at least 5 things that I'm convinced this story is meant to do in our minds. 5 reasons to give the story as we have it, and 5 reasons that serve Moses' purpose in telling it. 5 reasons that this story helps us to think rightly about God and humanity and human history. So 5 things. Let me just list them for you, and then we will take them in turn, and those will be kind of the 5 points of the message, okay? So first of all, the first reason is to demonstrate that Noah's righteousness was not always consistent. The first reason to tell the story is to demonstrate that Noah's righteousness was not always consistent. Secondly, the second reason to tell this story is to demonstrate very quickly and very thoroughly, quickly and very thoroughly validate God's statement about the continued wickedness of mankind. God had just made a covenant that assumed the ongoing sinfulness and wickedness of men, and this story serves to demonstrate that that was valid. And it does it very quickly. Third purpose, to connect this story of Ham's sinfulness with the later sinfulness of the Canaanites and their later service to Israel. Okay? It's kind of a historical line that you can draw and should draw. The fourth reason, to demonstrate the faithfulness of God to keep His covenant despite the sinfulness of man. God makes a covenant, I won't do this anymore despite the sinfulness of men, and immediately He's confronted with the sinfulness of men. And the fifth reason is to show that the promise of a restoration for mankind unto God is still not lost in the hearts of some. And that this hope and this promise is still what is driving the story that Moses is writing forward. It's still this hope to be restored unto God that is still driving the narrative forward as Moses writes. So those 5 things. And we'll take them in turn. If you're like me, when you hear things like this, you've probably already forgotten 3 of the 5, and it's very good for us to go through them. Now, first of all, to demonstrate that Noah's righteousness was not always consistent. We have heard, until now, that Noah was a righteous man, that he was blameless in his generation, that he walked with God, and he did. We've heard about his obedience to do all that God commanded him to do concerning the ark and the preservation of the animals and his family. And if that's all we read about, we may well begin to get that all too familiar, all too common problem in some Christian circles. I think you know what I'm talking about, this idea of hero worship. You know, where we get Hebrews 11 and we call it the Faith Hall of Fame. And that's very common, and I've called it that, and I wish I hadn't, and I don't condemn you if you had, but I wish you hadn't either. It's not a hall of fame. Fame for what? It's God who was faithful. Hebrews 11 proves the faithfulness of God, not the faithfulness of men. And we can elevate this man, Noah, to such an extent that he no longer seems real or relatable. Right? I mean, Noah was righteous. I mean, Noah, look who his neighbors were. Look how bad things were. And look, he was walking with God. I don't know anybody that's not in some way affected by their surroundings and by the people around them. And I don't know anybody that in some way doesn't know from experience that they themselves, that there's something within them that's wrong, that's off, that is disobedient to God, that desires things that are wrong. So Noah can seem like a legend and not a man. James deals with this same issue, right? When he mentions in his book, he mentions Elijah and his praying for and against the rain, and he says, look, when you think about Elijah, you think, well, I could never pray that God would just not rain. It wouldn't rain for a period of years, and then pray again and the rain would come. I couldn't be like that. He says Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. He says, listen, he was a man, and you're a man or a woman. You're a human being, aren't you? Trust God like Elijah did. And so he grabs you, and he knows you've exalted Elijah in your mind so that he's not relatable, and he does what's true for him isn't true for you, and that doesn't apply. You can never do what he did, and he says you can. He was no different than you. And so one of the reasons, I think, to tell this particular story about Noah is to have a clear demonstration of Noah's failure. His failure now is not the great sin of this section. That belongs to Ham. But his failure in his sin, his drunkenness, is clearly the occasion of Ham's great sin. If Noah had never gotten drunk in this way, Ham never would have sinned in this way. He didn't have the opportunity to do it in this way. Drunkenness is certainly a sin in and of itself. No doubt his sin did act in Ham's mind to give a greater reason to despise and think low of his father. Just think about that for a second. I don't know, I mean, this may be true. Well, I know it's true for the women as well, but it's especially true for the men. You grow up, and in a lot of ways, there's at some point in your childhood where you stop seeing your father as your hero, and you begin to see him as just a man. It just happens because we are just men. And it's impossible that Ham saw Noah in this way and that this didn't affect him and cause him to think lower and less of his father than he did. It was the occasion of this sin. However little he might have thought about Noah before, however much he the tension there may have been or problems, this occasioned Ham to do something he had never done before, to cross a line he'd never crossed before, and to invite his brothers in on it with him. It's something. And so, not that Noah deserved this, not at all, but that his own sin was an occasion and partly a cause, a contributing factor in Ham's sin against him. Now, the lesson for us in this is not to excuse or make light of sin, but rather to make us all the more diligent against sin. Right? When you think about other men in the faith and you think about their own shortcomings, you shouldn't say, well, see, sin's not a big deal. They had sin, it's no big deal. You don't hear about David and his sins and say, well, see, fidelity doesn't matter, murder doesn't matter. No, you read all the story and you think it cost him dearly. And it cost God dearly to forgive him of his sins. This matters. I'm going to be more diligent, because even David could fall in this way. Even Noah. Look what he's done. Look at the high points of his life, and now look. Look what he does. Look at his shame. Look at the sin. You may have thought that Noah was as righteous as they come. That he was this solid rock of virtue that could never even sin against God. This is Noah, who walked with God. I mean, God destroyed mankind from the earth, but Noah found favor with God. He believed God, and in obedience he followed orders from God and was delivered. All of his neighbors were killed. All the world was taken, Jesus says. And Noah alone was left with his family. And yet, even Noah was not perfect. He had faults and flaws. There was at least this one time when he drank far too much in excess and wound up passed out drunk and naked in his tent. What a thing. Now we're thinking about Noah here and kind of bringing him down a notch in our thinking. And I just would say this, no doubt we don't have the details here of all the things that happened. We're just told the essentials of the story to move the story along so we understand the main plot line. Moses does not invite us to speculate too much into the sort of scene this must have been in terms of his stumbling and mumbling, staggering behavior, etc. We're not told the details. Right? The things that he said or didn't say, the gestures he made, things that were going on. We're just not told. The point of Moses does not lie in those details, but rather in the fact that it happened. And then more than that, what we see later, the sin of Ham that came out of this situation. Now, second point. So that's the first point, is to show us some of Noah's sin, that he wasn't perfect. Secondly, then, to quickly and thoroughly validate God's statement about the continued wickedness of mankind. I say quickly and thoroughly. God had just made a covenant that presumes on the continued sinfulness of mankind and presumes upon their violent and offensive behavior in the future. That their behavior is unchanged and that their behavior is strongly cast into their fallen nature. It won't change. Now suppose that you read next, so that the rest of Genesis 9 was not there, and you read next about Genesis 10, about the spread of the nations, and then in 11 about the eventual sinfulness of mankind at the Tower of Babel, which comes in chapter 11. Well, if you read it that way without this story, then you miss something. You're still going to see the sinfulness of man, that they get to this place where they defy God in this way, but you don't see it with the same immediacy and the same force as if the very same people who walked off the ark quickly begin to sin in what are some very shocking and offensive ways. I mean, doesn't it say the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark? We're talking about the people who were on the ark, the ones who God preserved. Not their children, them. Them. God saved you. God spared you specifically. You were on the ark and you walked off and sinned in this terrible way. It's immediate. It's thorough. It's quick. It's sudden. It's not their children. It's them. It's not 10 years later. We're not told how long it is. Doesn't really matter. Noah began to do this. This is what happened. What a thing. As it is, you're faced immediately with a validation of all that God just said about humanity. He was not wrong. Sin was spreading again over the world with every next step that humanity took. Right? With every next step humanity took on the earth, sin was spreading on the earth because of the sinfulness of men. Well, what was Ham's sin? I mean, if this is meant to be a demonstration of this, what was it? Well, verses 22 and 23. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. I mean, that doesn't sound great, but it doesn't sound, I mean, he saw that he was naked and he told his brothers about it. That doesn't sound too shocking, too offensive. That doesn't seem too bad at first, but contrast it with the action of his two brothers, and we begin to see. Then Shem and Japheth, what did they do? They took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. You should not read this story, or these two verses, as just first this happened and then next this happened. Rather, first this happened, and here was how Ham responded. He went out and told his brothers about it. But his brothers, how did they respond? How should Ham have responded? Well, they responded this way. They heard about it, and they did all they could to preserve the dignity of Noah and the innocence of their eyes. They took a garment together. They planned together. They grabbed this like a blanket or whatever it was, and they put it on one shoulder, and the other one put it on his other shoulder, and they walked backwards into the tent. They got back to where he was, and they laid it down, and they covered their father, and they left. What a contrast between these two brothers and Ham. When they hear about it, again, they immediately grab a garment, and together ensured that they covered their father in such a way as to keep his dignity and their innocence. Now, when you see that contrast, you can begin to color Ham's actions a little bit and get a better feel for what he did. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. That word saw, it's the same way when the Lord, sees this and sees that. It's an examination. So he doesn't just kind of note, oh, Dad, hey, guys, Dad's naked in there. We need to do something about it. Instead, he goes in. Remember, Noah he drank of the wine and became drunk and laid uncovered in his tent. Which that might sound weird, especially to some of you kids, but this is the way they lived. They lived in tents. And so Noah has his own tent. And these men and their families, they have their own tents. So here Noah is out drunk, and he's so drunk, he ends up passed out naked inside there. We know he's passed out because verse 24 says, when Noah awoke from his wine, not from his nap, not from his evening sleep, from his wine. He's passed out drunk and naked. What a shameful display. That's not enough. Ham's not just sitting there saying, man, it's hard to see Dad like this. Instead, he goes in to view more or to do more. What's he doing in there? And then he goes out and tells, hey guys, look what I did. Check it out. Come in, come watch, come see. We're not told these details as to what happened in there. And it doesn't matter to us too much. But you see his attitude here. How shameful he acts as a son. Yes, Noah acts shameful as a father, but it's all the worse the way Ham is. But be careful not to say too much. There are many, if you were to research this in ancient commentaries and things like this and see what people say, and even some modern ones, men often say too much. And without getting graphic in any way, let me just say, many have said far too much and speculated about what sorts of outrageous things a sinful person might do to a passed out naked man in the privacy of his tent. How might he have defiled or sinned against his father? How might he have expressed hatred of his father? Or perhaps even his own perversion? I don't want to speculate on this because Moses doesn't speculate on this, and it serves us no purpose to do that. But just to say, we're not told entirely what happened. So those details are left out, but you see it when you begin to contrast Ham in his response to Shem and Japheth in their response. You can see why it is when Noah wakes up, he might be outraged when he realizes what's gone on and why this is a problem, why this demonstrates not just, well, Noah did some shameful things, but how thoroughly accurate God was when he talked about the continued wickedness of mankind. Next thing then, to connect this story, the next purpose in telling this is to connect this story of Ham's sinfulness with the later sinfulness of the Canaanites and the Canaanites' later service to Israel. Look at verse 25. Let's start at verse 24. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers." A servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. Let me quickly argue for separating verse 25 from verses 26 and 27. Many times I think we read this, verse 25, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers." And we go on, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." So it's as though you got 3 times where we're talking about Canaan being a servant to his brothers, and it's kind of all this curse. But look, you have in verse 25, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Verse 26, he also said, Moses inserts, this is a separate saying. So he said this cursed be Canaan. He also said, "Blessed be the Lord." So you have one statement is a curse, cursed be Canaan. The second is a statement of blessing. Verses 26 and 27 is a blessing. He's blessing God for what he sees, and we'll talk about this in a minute, God's going to do. But in verse 25, it's a curse upon Canaan. So you have 2 very different things. So in verse 25 is this curse upon Canaan, and this, I say, is mentioned specifically to draw the line from Ham's sinfulness to the later sinfulness of the Canaanites and to their service to Israel. Something of a prediction. Cursed will Canaan be. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Whereas in verse 26, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." It's rather, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge, we have in verse 27, may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. It's a different tense. Now, so here we are, something of a prediction of a curse here. This is what he sees will happen. It's interesting. Ham does the sinning, and who gets cursed? Cursed be Canaan. Canaan, his son. It tells us twice, right? Before we tell the story, you can't understand the curse that Noah utters unless you first understand what Moses has told you twice. Verse 18, Ham was the father of Canaan. And then verse 22, Ham, the father of Canaan. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, Ham sins and this other guy is cursed. Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. The curse, the retribution upon Ham is that him and his descendants, he's told, your descendants will be a servant of servants, will be the lowest of the low. The lowest, the least servant possible. They will have the lowest estate in the world. Remember, this is an instance in which there are only 4 families in the world. There's Noah and his wife, and then there's these 3 descendants and their wives. And Noah says to Ham, listen, Canaan, your prized descendant here, is going to serve in the lowest possible fashion the others. Wow. That's pretty profound. You learn that Ham was the father of Canaan from what Moses says, but you see it later in Genesis chapter 10 when you see that it says the sons of Ham are Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Now, you also get from Genesis chapter 10 and verse 15 that Canaan, when you start to learn about Canaan, that he was the father of a number. Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Archites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites, which matter so much to you, I know. But you go on reading later in the Bible and you find these are the people known later as the Canaanites, right? In the land where all these Canaanites, these descendants of Canaan settled, and all their clans and their tribes and their lands, and they were all there, and the people of Israel went into that land that God gave them and dispossessed them of the land. Go with me a couple chapters later in Genesis, to Genesis 15 and verse 16. God is speaking to Abraham, and he's saying, listen, your descendants are going to go to Egypt. They're going to be there for 400 years. This is what's going to happen. Later, though, they're going to come back. I'm going to judge this nation they're going to serve. Later they'll come back, and I'll give them all this land out here. Verse 16, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation. Why wait so long? For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The full measure of their sin is not yet complete. Well, the Amorites are descendants of Canaan. So these Canaanites are a wicked group. Just like their father Ham, in whatever it was we're not really told he had done and the way he had acted to Noah, his descendants we find doing the same kinds of things later. Their iniquity wasn't yet complete. It gets that way eventually. Their sin rises to such a height that God acts suddenly and violently and wipes them, for the most part, off the face of the earth. One example I'll give, I'll talk about just to describe the sinfulness of this people, though there are many ways we could describe it. I'll just talk about Moloch, the false god they created and served. He was a Canaanite god of the underworld. He was the statue they made for him was a kind of a bull head with a bull head with a human body, whose belly was real big. It was a big fire, and inside that fire, which was there, then you had these arms of Moloch that stood out, and this is what we're told. This is what archaeologists believe. And what would you put there in his arms? Your child, who would burn, right? And it wasn't just little babies. It was kids up to 4 years old. You'd burn them, kill them, offer them to Moloch so that you could gain his favor in this world now. What a thing. This is the kind of thing that the Canaanites were doing. Now, so there is this curse, and they're rightly cursed, and there's a connection that can be drawn between the sin of Ham and the sinfulness of the Canaanites later and those tribes, those clans. But also what we find is, he says, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. And I want you to see from 2 texts in the Old Testament where that comes to pass. One is in Joshua chapter 16 and verse 10. We're talking here about the country of Israel being divided up. This section goes to these people, this section to these people, and what they should do. And we read in Joshua 16:10, however, they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites have lived in the midst of Ephraim to this day, but have been made to do forced labor. So the Israelites, who had been forced labor in Egypt, had their own source of forced labor in the land of Canaan, namely the Canaanites. Many of them were killed, many were not. They were made to do forced labor. A servant of servants, the lowest of the low. You know, if you're an Israelite and you've got a servant, well, your servant's got a servant. There's some things your servant doesn't do. Who does them? Well, those Canaanites. Let them do it. Force them to. Well, they won't do it. Well, it says forced labor, doesn't it? Which means something like do it or die. And that's how they lived. This lasted for a while. We read in Joshua 16, it says, however, they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites have lived in the midst of Ephraim to this day. It's a long time. Generation after generation after generation, living, doing forced labor. One other passage to turn to is 1 Kings chapter 9. 1 Kings chapter 9, this is in the midst of Solomon's reign. And in verse 21, we read, starting in verse 20. All the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the people of Israel. These are the Canaan's descendants, the Canaanites. Their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the people of Israel were unable to devote to destruction, these Solomon drafted to be slaves. And so they are to this day. So even after the time of Solomon. So they came in during the period of Joshua, and they decided to make some of them slaves. And that happened for a while. And then some of them, maybe some of them aren't made to be slaves anymore, or some of them still are serving in some ways. But then King Solomon comes, and what does he do? Well, we got slaves in this country. Well, now they're my slaves. And he drafts them into his service. And so they remain, at the time of whoever's writing 1 Kings, they still remain forced slaves. So you see this come to pass. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers. I mean, you want to say here's an Israelite trying to justify the keeping of these slaves and forcing them to do these things. After all, we have all these laws. God tells us how to treat our slaves. Well, yeah, but remember what happened? Remember what Ham did? It says that cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. The lowest of the servants. God said this was going to happen, and it's happening in our midst. So you see it filled out, or you see it come to fruition there. Now, so that's another reason to connect this story of Ham's sinfulness with the later sinfulness of the Canaanites and their eventual service to Israel. It's at least that. It might be more. He says, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers, plural. And from Shem, one of his brothers, comes the Israelites. How it works out with the other brothers, I don't know. But at least that much we can say. Now, the fifth and the last thing I have here. This is the fourth one. To demonstrate the faithfulness of God to keep his covenant despite the sinfulness of man. To demonstrate the faithfulness of God to keep his covenant despite the sinfulness of men. Look at verses 24 and 25 again. When Noah, actually, let me stop for a second, and I want you to read this first. Let's start in chapter 8 and verse 21. I want you to read there, the last half of verse 21. He says, neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. Earlier in the verse, he says, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. You remember, the first time mankind sinned, Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, God does what? He curses the ground on account of men. Right? Now, we read in verses 24 and 25 of Genesis 9. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." Some real differences there. God's not cursing, explicitly at least. Noah's the one cursing. Now, Noah might be this comes to pass, so Noah might be invoking a curse in a righteous way, in a sense from God. But the second thing to notice is that the curse is not upon the earth, it's upon Canaan. Do you see that? That's all the more evident when I want you to notice, I want to draw some similarities, some parallels to the way that, as we've been talking about, when the flood, from the original creation and the work week of God and the blessing that comes upon man when he embarks out on the world, how similar that is to the flood account when everything's in chaos again and then things are ordered again, the inhabitants come out again, and God blesses man again. They're so similar, this original creation and what you might almost call a recreation. Let me give you some more parallels here in the way things are told. We're told in Genesis 2, God planted a garden. We're told here, Noah planted a vineyard. In Genesis, in the fall story, we're told that from the fruit she ate and he ate. We're told here that Noah drank from the wine. We read after that, their eyes were opened, right? They ate of the fruit and their eyes were opened. Well, and they saw that they were naked, right? Their eyes were opened to see there was something shameful here. Noah, he became drunk and uncovered himself in his tent. They saw that they were naked. Ham saw his nakedness. God made them clothing. Shem and Japheth took clothing and put it on their shoulders. God clothed them with these animal skins. They covered the nakedness of their father and did not see. God knew what happened and called them to account. Noah woke up, knew what his son had done, called him to an account. God cursed Satan, and God cursed the earth, and God brought consequences upon Adam and Eve. Noah curses Canaan. There were blessings by God in those curses about something that would come later, a promise of what would come, a restoration. And here, Noah in verse 26, blessed be the Lord. There's a blessing. They're so similar. This is significant. You'll notice that we have two very similar patterns, but the starking difference is God does not curse the ground as he promised he would not do. The story is told in ways with words that are so similar to the earlier fall to make you think this way, to have in your account, to go back and think, now God said this is really similar to what happened before, and God said he wasn't going to act this way again, and he doesn't. He doesn't act that way. When the curse comes, it's off of Noah's lips. God doesn't show up and curse the earth again. Noah's cursing Canaan. God might be cursing Canaan through Noah, but God's not cursing the land as he said he was. And I think Noah reflects on this. And it causes him to say something else besides just the curse. And he also said, verse 26. So we see the faithfulness of God despite the sinfulness of man. I think, again, Noah reflects on that. I think this lands upon Noah, the faithfulness of God. God's not done what he might have done. He's promised he wouldn't do it, and he's not done it. And so he makes this other statement, which shows, I think, the promise of a restoration for mankind being brought back unto God is still not lost in the hearts of men. This is the last reason I have for why to tell this story, that there's some hope, and the promise is still what drives the story forward, the promise of God. So Noah says, he also said, blessed be the Lord. I mean, he just got done cursing his son. This is what's going to happen to you. And he stops. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. And you think, what is going on? Something has landed upon him in his mind with a weight and with a hope to set him to rejoicing and a blessing God. I cannot imagine that as a father. If I get to the place where I'm pronouncing curses upon my children, that I turn around in the next breath and bless God. Something drastic has happened. He's thinking, his thoughts are no longer about the evil and the sinfulness of his son, but rather in spite of that, about the goodness and the grace of God. And he sets out to pronounce a blessing. There are about 100 different interpretations of this blessing that he pronounces in the verses 26 and 27. I can only give you mine. Okay? If you're not satisfied with mine and you don't want to claim it as your own, research for yourself and come up with a solution. But I can give you mine. This is how I understand the blessing. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. He's blessing the Lord, but what a blessing to Shem. He's thinking about the promise that God has made, that He won't judge the world in this way because He's made some promises to the world. And so Noah's thinking about those promises and what that means for his children. And he just cursed Canaan, and it's going to be hard for Canaan. At some point in history, it's going to be very, very difficult for Canaan, as he is a servant of servants to his brothers. But is all lost for Canaan? Is this all we have to look forward to? Not at all. God has promised. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. The God of Shem. What a blessing that is, not just upon the Lord, it's a blessing upon Shem as well. That the Lord is the God of Shem. He sees that. This is going to happen. Let me read one text, not to show it happening, but to show what I think is in Noah's heart as he says this. In Psalm 144, verse 15 says, "Blessed are the people to whom such blessings fall. Blessed are the people whose God is the Lord." Happy are the people whose God is the Lord. He sees and he blesses God. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. And let Canaan be his servant. And you think, well, that's not good. Well, no, Canaan, yes, he's going to be a servant, although this low servant, this menial servant to his brothers. But let it be in such a context that when he's a servant to his brothers, the Lord is the God of his brothers. The Lord is the God of Shem. And in that connection, if this is going to be fulfilled, let it be fulfilled in the connection that the one he's serving, that one is his God is the Lord. Let Canaan be his servant. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. Now, his servant can be taken a couple different ways, and I'm torn, and commentators are torn, and they have all sorts of different interpretations. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. So there will be this connection between Shem and his descendants and the Lord, that God will just be his God. And Shem will be his people. And let Canaan be his, could be the Lord's servant. And let Canaan be his servant. Blessed be the Lord, who is he? The God of Shem. And what else about the Lord? Let Canaan be his servant. So that Canaan, who is a servant of servants to his brothers, and lowly and despised, who is as a nation, as a people, is put to such low use, will get to serve God. This is similar. Don't you find Paul talking to slaves in this way in the New Testament? Serve your master, but listen, you're serving the Lord Christ. It's Him you're serving. There's a sense in which, despite your low estate in the world, you can still be a servant of God. And is he talking about that? Is he saying that Canaan would be a servant of God? He's seeking that, or is it rather that Canaan would be yes, he's going to be a servant of Shem, but it's in connection. It's in the context of Shem serving God as well, knowing God. What else does it say? Verse 27, may God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. My understanding here, may God enlarge Japheth. So there are riches and abundance and blessing that comes to Japheth just in this world. and his descendants. And let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Where is that? Well, Shem is, he's the one whose God is the Lord. And Japheth takes up residence there. And there is a unity and a blessing that's there in the context of the blessing of God. When the Lord is God, you see this. It's a blessing for Shem. It's a blessing for Canaan. It's a blessing for Japheth. And let Canaan be his servant. Here again, Canaan is a servant, but it's in this context. Blessing for Japheth. He's dwelling in the tents of Shem. He's getting in on that blessing with God as well. And Canaan is there as a servant. But not as a despised servant. You see? This is the context of blessing. No, he cursed Canaan already. Now he says, and he also said, blessed be the Lord. And he begins to bless God. Because he's moved by what God has not done. Cursed the earth. He's moved by the steadfastness of God. So, it's shocking in a way. Noah goes through the flood. I mean, Noah lives in a think about Noah's life. He's living in the time which is maybe one of the most sinful times of human history. God acts decisively to destroy mankind from the face of the earth. And it's just Noah and his family that's left. He blesses God and he makes an offering to God and vows to God and on this altar gives of all these animals. He sets out and God blesses them and makes a covenant and says, when you see this, though you deserve it, I'm not going to destroy you all. And it's like, he's got to be asking, why not? Right? And he's thinking back to his own namesake. Remember, they had hoped that in me was going to be a restoration. Well, I'm not able to bring it, but I remember God had promised that. And so it rains again, and he sees the bow, and he thinks God's not going to kill us. He sees his son sin in some way, and he thinks he knows what they deserve. And he sees the bow in the clouds again, and he remembers God's promise he's not going to kill us. Not in that way. He's not going to wipe us out again. We can move forward in this now on the earth. And then one day he gets out and he gets drunk. And it's a shameful thing. And his son acts in such a shameful way. He wakes up, and not just in anger, though he certainly probably was angry, but he pronounces this curse upon Canaan because he knows what Canaan deserves. And he probably here, is right in this curse. He's right to curse him in this way because it comes to pass. We know no curse settles on a man. No curse that a man speaks settles on a man unless it's right, unless it's backed by God. So he pronounces this curse. And he gets to thinking that it's been a while since God's cursed anything. And he sees that bow again and he remembers, right? God promised not to curse the earth again. And he hasn't cursed the earth again, despite the outrageous sin of Ham. And he blesses God, and he's moved, and he's confident. Think of it, look at his confidence as he just blesses God for the blessing that's going to come upon humanity. What a thing. So he's hopeful, and we ought to be. We ought to read this story and not just think, oh man, look how bad it was, but think, yes, how bad it was, how serious God took sin, but look at the steadfastness of God to bring blessing upon men like Ham and his descendants, despite the consequences of their sin that come, despite the lowest state they might be in. Blessing will come. And after that, we just read it. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Moving on. It's incredible. It's like Moses isn't interested in telling you all about Noah's life. He wants these things to land on you the way they landed on Noah. He wants them to land on you so that you understand the story arc. And you're looking and reading Genesis, looking for the restoration of what was lost. Looking for the fulfillment of the promise. For the upending of all that the devil is doing in the world. And the success he's having. For the end of this rebellion against God. When will this come? Well, these are the generation of the sons of Noah. I mean, this blessing, blessed be the Lord, and all these things that are going to come, and the good things that are going to come to these descendants. Tell us, What comes of them? These are the generations of the sons of Noah. And you begin to read, and you're hopeful and thoughtful about these things again. Moses means for you not to lose sight of this main purpose for his writing. Well, so then, don't, right? What are these 5 reasons to write the story for Moses? Maybe he has more. I think at least these. I'll read them one more time, and we'll close in prayer. First of all, to demonstrate that Noah's righteousness was not always consistent. We get that in verse 21. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Secondly, to quickly and thoroughly validate God's statement about the continued wickedness of mankind. We get that in verses 22 and 23. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. He saw it. He didn't just glance, he saw it. He discovered it, he examined it, he saw it. And he went and told his 2 brothers outside. You contrast that with Shem and Japheth, who took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward. They did not see their father's nakedness. What a contrast. You see Ham just stand out here, the wickedness of man. Third, to connect this story of Ham's sinfulness with the later sinfulness of the Canaanites and their eventual service to Israel. Fourth reason, to demonstrate the faithfulness of God to keep his covenant despite the sinfulness of men. Again, verses 24 and 25, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." You find absent from there any curse specifically from God, and you find absent from there what God promised would be absent, namely a curse upon the earth for the sake of men. And then lastly, to show that the promise of a restoration for mankind unto God is still not lost in the hearts of men, and that this hope and this promise is still the thing that is driving this story of Genesis forward. That's the main agenda of the narrative. Well, are there questions or comments on any of this that we've considered today? I've tried to handle this matter delicately as much as I can.